We are currently on the location of the corner of Spring Road and State Route 127, also at one time known as the Anthony Wayne Parkway. At this stop, we will be talking about General Anthony Wayne in particular and some other generals, Arthur St. Clair, for whom St. Clair Township is named, and General Richard Butler, for whom Butler County is named. We will have all three of those gentlemen. This rock, this big boulder, was placed here in October of 1941. It says, General Anthony Wayne and his men camped here at 5 Mile Spring, September 1793. It was dedicated here by the John Riley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. We've come back behind the farmhouse where things are a little quieter than they were down on the highway of 127, the Anthony Wayne Parkway. Because of all the traffic down there, the noise gets very loud. So back here, things are a little quieter, a little more peaceful, and we can talk about the importance and the significance of this property that we are sitting on right now. Before I go into the information about General Anthony Wayne, I want to back up a little bit and go back several years and talk about some men that I have mentioned earlier through the course of the day, and that would be General Arthur St. Clair and General Richard Butler. As we've already mentioned, St. Clair is the namesake for St. Clair Township, and Butler is the namesake for Butler County. The pioneers named things for what they saw, for people who had been here prior to them, for important events that took place or that was taking place in their lives. They named it for geographical. In other words, what did they see? Was it a place rocky? Was a place flat? Was it somewhat mountainous? All of those things go into how they chose to name their areas. So when Butler County was being formed in late 1803, the founding fathers of Butler County chose to name this county after Richard Butler, and St. Clair Township the same. They chose to name it after Richard Butler and Arthur St. Clair. When the Revolutionary War was over, we really didn't even have an army. The men went back to their homes, they went back to their lives, and the world kind of returned to normal. And the difference was that we were now a nation. We were no longer 13 little colonies along the eastern seaboard that were property of King George, King of England. We were now 13 states joined as the United States of America. George Washington had been appointed as the first president. He was reluctant to take the position, but he was the one that needed to be chosen. And as history shows, he was the right choice, and many of his decisions that he made at that time have proven to be the right decisions. One of the decisions that he made was that since we no longer are 13 little colonies that are being told what to do by a king thousands of miles away across an ocean, is that we need to do some exploration out beyond those 13 colonies and find out what is beyond that area along the coast, along the Atlantic Ocean. George Washington had actually, even 20 and 30 years prior to the American Revolution, he had been out in the Ohio country as a surveyor. He was familiar with this area, and he wanted to open it up for American settlers and give them the opportunity to move west, make their own farms, make their own businesses, make their own lives, and just to have the adventures that he had when he was a surveyor as a much younger man back in the 1740s and the 1750s. One of the decisions he made was to appoint a man by the name of Arthur St. Clair, who had been a decorated and courageous soldier and general during the Revolutionary War, to lead a group of men, troops, into the Ohio country. And Arthur St. Clair chose as his second in command, the person who would be next under him, was Richard Butler, General Richard Butler. And he was also a well-respected and highly decorated general from the Revolutionary War. So these men knew what they were doing when it came to fighting the British redcoats. So George Washington appointed the two of them. They got their troops together, and they started west into what we now know as Butler County, Ohio. Now, one of the things we need to know about that group of men that Arthur St. Clair and Richard Butler put together is, if they would have tried, they probably couldn't have found a worse group of men to be their army. Most of them were prisoners that were given freedom from prison if they would agree to go into battle against the Indians and become part of Richard Butler and Arthur St. Clair's army. Many of them, they came straight from jail and went right into the army. They were not well-disciplined people and didn't know how to take orders very well, and probably one of the reasons that they were in jail to begin with, but they chose to buy their freedom by joining the army. So they headed out here toward what would eventually become Butler County, Ohio. And in 1791, a small fort was built on the banks of the Great Miami River. Now, where the fort sat is now the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that you would see if you crossed the bridge from Main Street to High Street into Hamilton. And it sat right there where that monument is, was where the fort was located. And that was in the summer of 1791 that they came here and built their fort. As the summer wore on and they were exploring and getting ready for their campaign, they did some clearing and sent guards out and guides and scouts out to see what the country was like, because they were coming in here with very little knowledge of what they were getting into. So as the fall of 1791 was approaching, they decided that it was time to continue their march and go north into Upper Ohio. And the whole purpose of being out here was to get rid of the Indian tribes, clear Ohio for these settlers to move in. So in the fall of 1791, Richard Butler and Arthur St. Clair gathered their men and proceeded to let them know that the time was drawing close that they were going to begin on their expedition. Not only did Arthur St. Clair and Richard Butler have an army of men that really didn't know what they were doing, somehow or another, they had ended up with a great deal of equipment that was just, it was bad. It was not equipment that was designed to do the job of cutting down hundreds, if not thousands of trees to clear a path. Keep in mind, we're talking about just forests of trees right next to each other, one right after another, compacted in. And to clear a path wide enough for a big wagon and several teams of horses or oxen to pull that, those trees had to be cleared. And it was not uncommon for them to only, in a whole day, maybe only go a few hundred yards or maybe a quarter of a mile of clearing enough brush and enough of these enormous, we're not talking little saplings, enormous trees that had been growing for hundreds of years. It took days and days and days, and their axes and their hatchets would splinter and fall apart. It was doomed from the beginning. So as September and October proceeded through, and it was a cold fall, it rained a lot and things were muddy. It snowed and it sleeted, and the men did not have good uniforms, warm uniforms. They didn't have enough food. This was a disaster from the word go. So as they proceeded to head north along through the state of Ohio, they actually crossed from their fort here on the banks of the Ohio River, the Great Miami River. They actually crossed the creek that we know as 7 Mile Creek, and it would be off to our distance here, off to the southwest. And that is the confluence of the 4 Mile Creek and 7 Mile Creek. And those creeks were named by Arthur St. Clair and his men when they left Fort Hamilton. The very first creek that they crossed was 2 Mile Creek. It was 2 miles from Fort Hamilton. Many of you know where Flubbs in Hamilton is located. Flubbs sits on 2 Mile Creek. It didn't in those days. So they crossed that little creek. They named it 2 Mile Creek. They continued on up through what is now the city of Hamilton, and eventually worked their way up what we would know as West Elkton Road. And some of you from this western side of the St. Clair Township might even know where Snake Hill is. Snake Hill is the as you approach the top of West Elkton Road and come down toward the creek, it's a very windy and steep, rugged little hill that comes down to the creek. And it crosses 7 Mile Creek. It comes to 7 Mile and 4 Mile Creek over here to our southwest. And that is where those men crossed that creek, and they named it 4 Mile and 7 Mile. At that one they named 4 Mile because that's where they crossed it. Eventually they would cross another creek on down past 7 Mile and name it 7 Mile Creek. Right behind us, as we mentioned earlier, is 5 Mile Spring. A spring is not as big as a creek, so consequently it is not called 5 Mile Creek. It's shorter, it's smaller, so it's 5 Mile Spring. So we had 2 Mile, 4 Mile, 5 Mile, 7 Mile. There's a 9 Mile Creek on up the road. So many of these creeks, that's how they received their names. As they crossed the creek over there, they came on through and proceeded to head north through the state of what we now know, the state of Ohio. So here is a map of Ohio. And so we're currently talking about, they left Fort Hamilton and they were going to eventually work their way up into the northern part of the state. I'll talk more about this map in a little bit. The men found themselves up in the area here of what is marked as Fort Recovery, and we'll talk about why it's called Fort Recovery after a little bit. But they found themselves up here in a little area in which they encountered the Indians, and that's where the battle took place. It's called the Battle of, it's actually called St. Clair's Defeat, was where is the actual name of the battle. So let me just kind of bring you back to thinking about this battle. So you have 2 well-respected generals, an army that really doesn't want to be an army, they just don't want to be in jail anymore, and tools and equipment that is not designed for the job, not enough food, not enough clothes. The winter is setting in early, the weather is awful, and they are working their way, chopping trees down as they go. The Indians, they know they're coming. It's not hard to see this large group of men, over around 1,200 men with their wagons, and many of them had their families with them, and they had girlfriends and wives and other people that would come along as their cooks and as that did the laundry and tried to kind of help give them some comforts of home. And so there's a large group of people traveling a few yards, a half a mile, a quarter of a mile a day up the way as they were working their way toward where they would eventually meet up with the Indians. So we find ourselves in November 4th of 1791. That morning, as the men were starting to just get up and be prepared for their day, they are attacked by an enormous tribe, an enormous company of Indians. It's not just one tribe. A number of tribes had joined together to try to run the white men, the settlers, out of the state of Ohio. So on the November 4th of 1791, Richard Butler and Arthur St. Clair find themselves surrounded and being massacred by this very large group of Indians. The battle was awful. It was bloody. The white settlers and the American army was just simply destroyed. There were so few of them left, and a few of them actually did escape and found themselves coming back to, actually made their way back to what is now Cincinnati, where there was another fort called Fort Washington, of course named after George Washington. That is how the word got back to settlement and to civilization about this terrible battle and the defeat that had taken place. I have some pictures of an artist. Now, these are obviously not original pictures. An artist has drawn some pictures of the battle. The picture that we see here is Arthur St. Clair, his army, and the man that is up against the tree, his name is Richard Butler, and he is the one for whom Butler County is named. And these are some of the American soldiers. Right here we have a picture taken in the town where this is now, where it actually present day Fort Recovery, Ohio, and there's a building that sits on the spot where Richard Butler died. And it says, General Richard Butler was killed by Indians beneath a tree which stood on the site of this building in St. Clair's defeat, November 4th, 1791. Let me tell you a little bit about General Butler's death. Here's another picture of General Butler as a military man, and a picture of him meeting his death. The story, there's two stories. One is that an Indian saw Richard Butler get a wound. He was just wounded a little bit. His men took him off the battlefield, put him up against a tree to kind of treat him and let him sit there and rest before he went back into the battle. One of the stories goes that there was an Indian sitting off in the distance on his horse. And as that Indian was watching what was going on, he knew who Richard Butler was. He knew he was an important person and that he was part of the commanding officers. So he comes flying, galloping out of the underbrush on his horse. And one of the stories is that the Indian took his tomahawk, his little hatchet, in one hand, and with the other hand, he reached down and he got a hold of Richard Butler's scalp, his hair and the skin that covers your skull. And he reached down, and in one move, he just simply removed Richard Butler's bloody scalp. He's got hair and skin and dripping blood and he goes running back into the battle, going back into the battle, and with that scalp, and it just made the Indians even more excitable and and more ready to defeat the white settlers who were trying to take over their land. We do know that Richard Butler was scalped. Possibly it was just an Indian on foot, but there's also enough evidence that it could have been one on horseback. But the wound was mortal. In other words, he could not recover from that wound. And this other picture, this picture then shows him up against the tree. This was just an artist who was drawing his rendition of the battle. And there's Richard Butler up against the tree, dying from his wounds. In that battle, not only was Richard Butler there, but he had two brothers as well, Edward Butler and Thomas Butler. And Edward is carrying Thomas off of the battlefield. Thomas is the one on the back. Thomas had been hit in the legs, in the thighs, with a musket ball. And that is it would be a huge bullet. He had taken a bullet to both thighs. It had penetrated both legs and broke his leg bones. Oddly and amazingly, he did survive that devastating wound. But as Richard was dying, he demanded that his two brothers escape, because Richard was mortally wounded and he knew he was not going to recover, and he wanted his two brothers to escape that battle. It was a terrible defeat, and it wasn't long before the few men who had survived made their way back into Cincinnati. It wasn't Cincinnati, it was just a little Fort Washington. Eventually, word got back to George Washington about what awful events had taken place. And he sent for General Butler, he sent for General Arthur St. Clair, because he did survive the battle. And George Washington sent for Arthur St. Clair and had him come back to Washington. He was stripped of his command, and it was very embarrassing and defeating emotionally and personally for him, to have considered where he came from as a Revolutionary War soldier, and for this event to have happened to him. So it was an ugly event. Now, as this whole thing transpired, George Washington decided that he knew just the man to send back out here to get this problem with the Indians taken care of and get the area ready for white settlers. The man that George Washington had in mind to do the job that he needed done to open up the Ohio country was a man by the name of General Anthony Wayne. General Wayne was the epitome of a soldier. The man always was thinking. He always had strategy in his mind. He never let anything just happen. He studied what he was going to be doing. He was prepared for every battle. Nothing just was, we'll see what happens with him. His nickname was Mad Anthony Wayne. It was a nickname that was given to him by his men. The Indians also had a name for him. They referred to him as the General Who Never Sleeps. He was probably one of those people that many of you might even be similar to this in your personality. You don't sleep well. You always have your mind on something. You're planning, you're thinking, you have something that it is that you want to get accomplished. And that's the kind of man that Anthony Wayne was. Well respected, well known, and as we proceed through the stories, you'll understand why the Indians referred to him as the General Who Never Sleeps, and when his men referred to him as Mad Anthony, it was that he never let anything just happen by chance. He had a plan. He was mad about getting it done, making sure that things happen. I have a picture of him here. Is a statue that is in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, near where he is buried. But Anthony Wayne is by far, he and George Washington are two of the earliest and most respected and well-known, even to this day, generals and early military men who were responsible for the growth of our country. So Anthony Wayne was given the job to come out here and take over where Arthur St. Clair had fallen short. Anthony Wayne gathered his army, and these men were not from prison. He gathered men who wanted to fight. He made them know that if they joined his army, they were there to stay. There would be no deserters. Deserters would be shot. You stayed with his army. If you joined, you were there until the job was done or you got killed. That was the only two choices if you joined in with Anthony Wayne. There were many men who were they were ambitious, they were adventurous, they wanted to explore, they wanted to see what was beyond the shores of the 13 original colonies and beyond those 13 new states. So they were ready they were ready to join and be part of the Anthony Wayne army. They learned how to march, they learned how to shoot, they learned how to take orders. They were ready to be an actual army. And that was vital to what would be taking place over these next years as Anthony Wayne proceeded to take up where Arthur St. Clair left off. So he also brought an army to Fort Hamilton, which I showed you the picture just a few minutes ago, where the fort sat on the Great Miami River in what is now the city of Hamilton. And he took his army, and for those of you, particularly the adults who might be in the crowd, you would know where 3rd Street is in Hamilton. When he left with his army, now keep in mind, some of the roads had already been cleared. I won't call them roads. Some of the paths had already been cleared by Arthur St. Clair's army. So he was able to use some of those roads, although the men were a little bit superstitious about those roads because those paths had led to defeat. They wanted to make their own roads and their own paths, and they chose a new route. So they came out of Fort Hamilton and proceeded to come north along what we would now know as 3rd Street, coming through the village of what we now know as New Miami, and eventually coming up what we know, and we are sitting right here on a busy highway of 127, the Anthony Wayne Parkway. In September of 1793, Anthony Wayne and his men camped right out here by the highway where the marker, the boulder is that we just looked at. And now as we're sitting here, I want you to think about the fact that this land, this ground that we are actually sitting on and standing on right now, was in September of 1793 full of men, full of soldiers. Some of them had fought in the Revolution. Some of them were younger men and wanted to maybe follow in their father's footsteps and get the experience and the excitement of battle. They had no idea some of them had no idea what lay before them, if they would ever even return, if they would live through these battles that they were going to be facing. But all of this property was covered with men, several thousand who camped here that night in September of 1793. When they got up that next morning, they proceeded to work their way up through 127, and which at that time was nothing more than trees, and they had to cut down the trees and make their own paths. And long story short, over the course of the next couple of years, Anthony Wayne built an entire system of forts. essentially they were about 1 day's march from the previous fort. So you could leave Cincinnati, which was Fort Washington, march north, and be at Fort Hamilton by the time you needed to put your men to bed and get them ready for the next day. You could march to Eaton, which we now know is Eaton, and that's where he had built Fort St. Clair in honor of his friend Arthur St. Clair, who had such bad luck. On up to Fort Jefferson, named after Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence. Fort Recovery, which was built near where St. Clair's defeat took place. On up then into Fort Defiance. And Fort Defiance is very near where Anthony Wayne's battle, that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, he had a battle up here and with the Indians in this general area here. And that was the last Indian battle before a treaty was signed. But Fort Defiance is named Fort Defiance simply because that was Anthony Wayne's way of saying to the Indians, ha, look what I just did. I just destroyed you guys, and here's my new fort. His last fort that he built is 30 miles west of the Ohio-Indiana state line, and it's called Fort Wayne. And Fort Wayne, he named, of course, after himself. That fort is built on the location of the Miami Indian headquarters. The name of their headquarters, the name of the Miami Indian land, their town, was called Michicanoqua. I'm sorry. It was their chief, Little Turtle, was Michicanoqua. Their town was called Keakonga. So let me say that again. The fort was built on the headquarters, on the town, in the village, the Indian village of Keakonga, and their chief, Little Turtle, whose Indian name is Chief Michicanoqua. And here is a picture, a statue of him. These pictures are, these are not original pictures of Fort Wayne. It has been rebuilt. The original Fort Wayne has been rebuilt. And many years ago, on a snowy winter day, I took my daughter and her friend, and we went there when they were looking at a college in that area to possibly attend college there. But it has been rebuilt the way it would have looked in its heyday, when right after Anthony Wayne would have had it built. But Chief Little Turtle, Chief Michicanoqua, was their chief of Keakonga, the little village here, where that was the capital village, like a capital city of the Miami Indians. So that was his last fort that he built was Fort Wayne, right up, and it's actually over in Indiana, but it's very close to the Ohio state line. So all of these, that would be a picture of all of Ohio and where those maps, where those forts would be in comparison to Fort Hamilton down here where we live. So in 1794, which would have only been about a year after, in 1793, in September of 1793, Anthony Wayne camped right here on this spot. 11 months later, in August of 1794, there was this battle up here near Fort Defiance, and that is where the Indians were finally defeated by, it was an Indian confederation, a large group of Indians, and they were defeated by Anthony Wayne's army. 1 year later, in August of 1795, there was a treaty signed in the village, what is now the village of Greenville, Ohio. There is a plaque. If you go into the town of Greenville, there is a plaque near that signifies and shows where this treaty was actually signed. But over here we see General Anthony Wayne and some of his important men in his company. And here we have Chief Little Turtle, and he's presenting, it's like a peace offering, presenting to Anthony Wayne. And essentially they're saying, okay, we give up, you can have this portion of land, and your white settlers can move into this portion. And the treaty stated that the Indians could have a certain part of what we now know as state of Ohio, and the white men could have a part, and the Indians could have a part. This treaty stayed in place, this peace treaty stayed in place for many years. And it was in the mid 1812, 1813, 15, 16, this treaty was breaking down. And as we learned back at the mill, when I was talking about Joseph Watson in 1816 wanting to leave his home in Trenton, New Jersey area and come here because things had gotten quite dangerous again. The Indians were their lands were being infringed upon by white settlers, and the Indians were rising up again. There's so much history that if any of you like to read about history and the Indians and the culture and military culture, these battles are just, they're so informative and just so exciting to read about. But this would be an author, an artist who drew his rendition, what he thought that the treaty signing could very well have looked like. The Indians on one side and the Americans on another, and a peace offering being presented. Well, Anthony Wayne was a very colorful character, and this happened in August of 1795, and a few months later, Anthony Wayne's health began to deteriorate. He was a heavy drinker, and just lots of things about his lifestyle caused his health to begin to deteriorate. And he actually died in December of 1796. So we're talking about a year and a half or so after this treaty that we just had the picture of. Anthony Wayne died. He died at a place up where New York and Pennsylvania borders join, and it's called Presque Isle. There was a fort there at Presque Isle, and that's where he died. And he was buried at the base of the gate, basically like the opening gate of the fort, at the stockade, the blockhouse, not the stockade, but the blockhouse. Near the flagpole was where his body was buried. Well, a number of years later, Anthony Wayne's daughter decided that she wanted her father's body moved back to the family graveyard near Philadelphia, which is down here, down in this area right here. And he was born here in Pennsylvania, and in Paoli, Pennsylvania, and so the whole family estate, I guess you'd call it the estate, was near Valley Forge, which you've heard of when you talk about George Washington and the Revolutionary War. So he was born and raised in that area. So we're talking 12 or 14 years after Anthony Wayne died. His daughter decided that she wanted her dad's body moved back to the family plot, as I just said. So she went to her brother Isaac and said, "Isaac, I want you to bring Dad's body back." Now, I'm sure Isaac was like, "Oh boy, I'm sure glad I get to do this job." So Isaac got things together and got himself prepared for this long trip. You can see where he was born and raised, and this is where he died, right up here. So he had to wait for the summer to because all these roads, I mean, keep in mind, we don't have gravel roads, we don't have paved roads in 1809. There's just dirt roads. So Isaac had to wait for the dry months. He had to wait for the spring rains to stop so that he could get in a wagon and travel the distance that it would be from the family area there in Philadelphia up here to Presque Isle, Pennsylvania. He traveled and he traveled and he traveled, and he finally arrived at the fort at Fort Presque Isle, and he told the fort doctor who he was and what he wanted to do, and presented papers for the approval of what he wanted to do, of digging up, the word is exhume, to exhume his father's body and put it on a wagon and take it back to Philadelphia, to the Philadelphia area, to the Valley Forge area. So who knows why, but once they dug up the body, and dug up the coffin, the casket that Anthony Wayne's body was in, Isaac wanted to see his father's remains. The doctor said, you know, okay, I think we can do that. Your dad's been dead 15 years, nearly 12 years, and it's been a long time, and the process of decay, I'm sure, you know, there would have been a skeleton. They were expecting to find a skeleton in the casket. When they opened it, lo and behold, there is Anthony Wayne in all of his glory. His body is as preserved as it would have been if he had died the day before. According to the reports, only a lower portion of one of his one leg had started into the decay process. So now Isaac has a problem on his hands. He has his father's body, which is probably preserved because of his father's drinking habit. He has this body out of a casket, out of the ground, and it's the summer. It's 90 degrees, it's hot, and he knows that he cannot go back without his father's body and meet his sister's anger. So the camp doctor comes up with this plan. Now, at this point in my presentation, if any of you have a weak stomach, you might want to stop listening. So the camp doctor comes up with a plan. He gets a big metal cauldron. Many of you know what I'm talking about, like a big cauldron that people would have used to cook and wash their laundry and whatnot. He gets this big pot of water and tells the men, get this pot of water boiling, and they proceed to undress the body of Anthony Wayne. They take off his uniform. Not only is he in his uniform, but his military sword has been buried with him, his helmet with all of the feathers, and just everything about his personal effects were buried with him, and they were quite regal. So all of them are removed from his body, and his body is placed into this boiling water. As many of you know, when you put a piece of meat into boiling water, it will fall off of the meat, gets tender, and the meat will fall off of the bone that it is attached to. And that is exactly what happened to the body of Anthony Wayne. So his flesh was put back into the casket that was just dug up earlier that day, and that is put back into the ground where it just came from. Anthony Wayne's bones are placed into a new casket and nailed shut and given to Isaac, and Isaac prepares for his trip back to the family the family area near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It's a gruesome story, an interesting story, but it has been verified by the Ohio Historical Society and the Pennsylvania Historical Society that it did actually happen. One of the so Isaac takes his father's body back, and they end up back in all of this distance that they have to travel to get from Fort Presque Isle. And this is the route that that's marked in black that Isaac would have taken to get from point A to point B. So he arrives back into the town where this burial is to take place. So Anthony Wayne's bones are reburied at St. David's Episcopal Church in Radnor, Pennsylvania on July 4th of 1809. There was quite a large parade, and it was July 4th. It was the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So they had a big parade, and they reburied his body and gave him full military honors again down here where he was buried in the Episcopal Church next to the other people in his family. Now, to kind of lighten the mood after that story, there is also a ghost story that goes along with this little story of Anthony Wayne and his demise. Anthony Wayne was born on January 1st. So the legend is that if you travel anywhere on this road on January 1st, you may encounter the ghost of Anthony Wayne. It is told that as Isaac was returning back home, that sometimes, because of the road was rough and rutted, that the casket, the coffin, would fall off of the wagon and pop open, and a bone might fall out. Some bones might fall out. And then he would pick them back up, put them back in the coffin, and continue on his journey. But the legend is that if you travel that road anytime on January 1st, you may encounter Anthony Wayne's ghost picking up his bones. Clearly, Anthony Wayne was an important figure in the settlement and in the history of the United States of America. Anywhere that you would go in Ohio, Indiana, even into Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Illinois, even out into Virginia, Massachusetts, any of those original 13 colonies, the name of Anthony Wayne is still known. He was very important and vital to the settlement, and without his efforts, it's not known whether or how long it would have taken to eventually open up what we know as Butler County and the whole state of Indiana and Ohio. When we looked at the rock down there, we saw the plaque. And on the plaque is a mention of an organization that it was placed by the John Riley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1941. These women, the Daughters of the American Revolution, are a group of women who can trace their lineage back to a Revolutionary War patriot. Someone who either fought or helped in the effort to win our independence and our freedom from a tyrannical king in England. The Daughters of the American Revolution, as I said, can trace their lineage back to someone who helped with the effort or actually fought. I am proud to say that I am a Daughter of the American Revolution. I belong to the Oxford chapter, and we can trace our lineage back to a number of men. One of them is William Cornett, another man by the name of Littlebury Witt, and Jacob Gabbard Sr., and John Couch, and there's several more men in my own family who were patriots who fought in the Revolutionary War. So these women from Hamilton chose to honor this site to make it known to the members, the people who live in Butler County, that how important Anthony Wayne was to our settlement here and to our history. And we thank the Daughters of the American Revolution. I want to draw attention one last time to some important information and a concept, a thought about General Anthony Wayne. On this rock is mentioned his encampment in September of 1793. In March of 1803, 9.5 years later, Ohio became a state. They had applied to the federal government. The 60,000 people that were needed to become a state had been met. There were a number of people obviously living here within the boundaries. And in 9.5 years, through the efforts of General Anthony Wayne, Ohio became a state.